our opening statements and questions, so bear with me for 1 second. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to the 84th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Pursuant to standing orders, today's meeting will be in a hybrid format. Therefore, there's no screenshots, photos, or recording allowed now that we're in session. I'm not going to go over all of the virtual stuff because Michael and Anna, hopefully you know what we're doing now. Had enough experience there. Just before we jump into the first session today, for members, I'd like to remind you that all amendments, including sub-amendments, must be submitted in writing and sent to our committee clerk. The deadline we established is November 29th, so that's coming up soon. Should you wish to propose amendments, please send the Legislative Counsel, Alexandra Shora, your written instructions, and she'll ensure that amendments are drafted in the proper legal format. Now, for today, we're continuing with our study of Bill C-53, an act respecting the recognition of certain Métis governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. And our first panel, I'd like to welcome Cassidy Caron, President, Métis National Council. And joining President Caron, we have her counsel, Alexandria Winterburn, and we need to have non-speaking supports, approval of the committee to join the main witness at the table. So I'm just going to ask for unanimous consent to have Ms. Winterburn join Ms. Caron at the table today. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and because Ms. Winterburn's appearing as legal counsel, we can't direct questions to her. You can ask technical legal questions to Ms. Caron, and then she may need to consult with Ms. Winterburn and then report back. So it's a bit of an oddity of how we're structured in the committee structure, but that's how it goes. So thank you for that. So welcome to the table as well, Ms. Winterburn. We're going to get right into it. We have 5-minute opening statements. So Ms. Caron, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours, and then we'll move into our rounds of questioning.
Great. Thank you for this opportunity to address Bill C-53, a critical piece of legislation for the Métis. I am a very proud Métis woman from Batoche in St. Louis, Saskatchewan. My ancestors fought in the 1885 resistance with a goal to preserve, protect, and defend the Métis way of life, fighting for much of the same ideals the Métis Nation continues to fight for today. I am the president of the Métis National Council. The MNC is comprised of and receives its mandate from the democratically elected leadership of the governments in the provinces of Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. For generations, the Métis Nation has been organizing, advocating, negotiating, and litigating to advance Métis rights. And for the past 40 years, the Métis National Council has been at the forefront of this struggle, supporting Métis governments' fight for respect and rights recognition and working together to advance the Métis Nation's cultural, social, economic, and political interests. Bill C-53 is the next step forward, and it will help what RCAP called the inexcusable governmental handling of Métis rights over the years. We must all be clear. The promise of Métis self-government legislation is not new. To believe that it is yet another example of Canada's systemic amnesia. Time and time again, your governments, your processes, your special representatives, your royal commissions, and your courts have recommended the negotiation of agreements that will legislatively recognize Métis self-government. In 1982, your federation agreed to amend your constitution to recognize and affirm the Métis Nation's inherent rights in Section 35, which includes the right to self-government. However, the failure of the late 1980s constitutional conferences left Section 35's promise to the Métis unfulfilled. In 1992, Canada came close to formally recognizing Métis self-government through the Charlottetown Accord, which included the Métis Nation Accord, an accord which would have committed the federal and provincial governments to negotiate the implementation of Métis self-government. Also in 1992, Joe Clark, as Minister for Federal Constitutional Affairs, introduced a historic resolution in Parliament supporting the constitutional rights of the Métis. It passed unanimously. Through it, the House of Commons supported by its actions the true attainment, both in principle and practice, of the constitutional rights of the Métis people. In 1996, your Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommended that the governments of Canada and of relevant provinces and territories be prepared to negotiate immediately with the appropriate Métis representatives on the manner in which Métis self-government will be recognized. When successive Canadian governments failed to uphold their promises and their commitments, Métis turned their focus to the courts to prove that Section 35 was not an empty promise to Métis. In 2003, 20 years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously confirmed in Powley that Métis are full-fledged rights bearers, that Métis rights are not derivative from First Nations rights or less than Inuit or First Nation rights. In Powley, Canada's highest court urged your governments to finally negotiate with the Métis and support Section 35 constitutional guarantee to the Métis for the recognition and affirmation of our distinct rights. In 2016, Daniels versus Canada, your Supreme Court unanimously confirmed that Canada has a constitutional responsibility to advance relationships with Métis in the same way it does for First Nations and Inuit. And there are even more examples where your processes have repeatedly led to the same recommendations, calling for the full recognition of Métis rights. In 2016, Canada's Ministerial Special Representative, Tom Isaac, released his report that included many of these same recommendations. He reminded Canada of its duty to reconcile with Métis and adhere to the honour of the Crown, which demands full implementation of its obligations to all Aboriginal peoples under Section 35. And even just this past June 2023, Canada committed in the UNDRIP Action Plan that, consistent with the commitment to co-develop approaches for the implementation of the right to self-determination, Canada will introduce federal legislation to implement the co-developed Métis self-government recognition and implementation agreements. Again, none of these conversations are new. Métis rights are not new. Métis self-government is not new. What is new is that Canada is finally taking action on what it has long promised. For 40 years, the Métis National Council has been a national voice for our Métis governments to advance the interests and priorities of Section 35 rights-holding Métis citizens that they represent, the Section 35 rights holders that Canada owes a duty to. Bill C-53 is a step to ensuring that Canada's now 40-year-old promise of Section 35 to the Métis is finally fulfilled. Simply put, it's time.
Thank you so much for your opening statement. And I just have to say, as a someone born and raised in Saskatchewan, I've been to Batoche many times, and absolutely amazing place. And I look forward to being able to visit again sometime in the future. With that, we're going to get into our rounds of questions. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, I have a quick visual card system. This means 30 seconds are left on the clock, and the red is time's up. Don't stop mid-sentence, but wind up the thoughts. We can get on to the next round of questions. First up, for 6 minutes, I have Mr. Schmale on my list, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for our witness for appearing today. I do appreciate her view, and to look forward to the back and forth that we're about to have. I think some of the statements we've had from whether it be chiefs in Ontario or Métis in Alberta is about land and governance, right? And I know this bill touches on the operating of Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, but at the same time, what was raised is what comes next, right? So Chief Alvin Fiddler, Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, talked about issues around land that he might perceive as issues going forward, right? The consultation piece that he's talking about. And he was pointing out that there are no exact borders. So how would you define potentially, if you see the treaty process which comes next, how do you see that coming together when you have chiefs in Northern Ontario saying, you know, in case of Grand Chief Fiddler, that these communities do not exist, they're fictional, was his words.
Thank you for the question, member. I think first and foremost, what is really important to focus on, and we've had these conversations, is, you know, what is in this legislation and what is not in this legislation. That's what we're here to study. The bill does not touch on the negotiation of lands. It does talk about future negotiations of treaties, but this bill is fundamentally doing two things. It's recognizing the status quo that's existed for the last 100+ years, that these are Métis governments and they represent Métis collectivities. When treaties are negotiated, they also don't necessarily need to be land treaties. Member Batiste has spoken about this in previous hearings, where treaties can also just refer to the peace and friendship treaties. It doesn't always necessarily lead to land. When the treaties are negotiated, if they are to impact First Nations rights, then there will be a duty to consult triggered, and they will be consulted. But at this point in time, this piece of legislation does not speak to that, and it's simply just about the internal governance of these three Métis governments.
You see it potentially coming back to land?
I can't predict the future there.
I think that was some of the concerns the Grand Chiefs in Ontario were talking about. It was the fact that it's true, the duty consult kicks in at the next phase, but at that point, there is no mechanism to bring that treaty piece back to Parliament. It was an order in council. I think that was the part that the chiefs were bringing to our attention, that if there was no kind of vote in Parliament on the treaty part, the duty to consult should have happened at the beginning, because there is no recourse on the second part, if you understand what I'm saying, right? So if the treaty comes and it does involve land and there is the consultation, the order in council would be the final approval, not the Parliament of Canada, which would have the ability to have this kind of discussion about it.
However, if the treaty negotiations result in something that would impact First Nations rights, that would trigger the duty to consult with that First Nation prior to the conclusion of the treaty.
Yeah, that's the other part, right? I think that's what we're trying to zero in now, and we're trying to figure out a path forward on this, is the fact that the governor and council could do this almost behind closed doors without the approval of Parliament. But it could include land. It might not. You're right. It might not, but it could. But I think that was the point the chiefs were trying to make, and I'm trying to kind of figure out a kind of a happy medium here. Would it be any? Would you have objections to a amendment that had a vote in Parliament on a treaty?
So because this piece of legislation is not Métis National Council's legislation, it is the legislation that was co-developed with these Métis governments, any amendments would need to be reviewed and approved by those three Métis governments, and the Métis National Council would then support the position put forward by those three Métis governments. When we're talking about, the order in council process for these pieces, there's a precedent that's already been set. And consistently throughout history, Canada has created double standards for the Métis. And that's exactly what this would be doing. So again, I think it's just important to know that there's a precedent, there's a process. If there are rights that will be impacted, that will trigger duty to consult. Those processes will be followed. And if there are amendments that are going to be made to this legislation, it has to go back in consultation and co-development with the partners who have co-developed this piece of legislation.
Okay, I think I have only 30 seconds left. I'll try to get a quick question in so you can answer. I was talking about testimony from the Manitoba Métis Federation, and they were quite concerned about membership and how that dovetails into Ontario. How do you view membership? I know what's in writing, and I know what's on your website and that, but how do you view membership in terms of historical communities, as MMF was talking about with Red River?
I'd say very briefly, if you can do like a one sentence, and if the side would like to carry on with their line of questioning, they can come back to it with the. We're a tight ship here. One sentence, and we're going to this side.
I can't do it justice in one sentence, other than the fact that our Métis governments have objectively verifiable Métis registries. Happy to build on that if a future question is to arise.
Thank you so much. We're going to go now to the Mr. Batiste for his 6 minutes.
Thank you for being here, Cassidy. There's been a lot of discussion at this committee about who is a Métis, and a lot of accusations that certain Métis organizations will allow anyone to be members and that there's no criteria, which is kind of interesting because I look to MNC's website and they have a resolution there passed by all that says Métis means a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, is of historic Métis national ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation, which is very consistent with what Pauli has ruled. I'm wondering if you have any processes in place whereby you're trying to verify the lists of various organizations if they're compliant with the MNC's definition, and is there any kind of independent evaluation being done on that membership list?
Thank you for the question. There have been many. And what I can say is that we know that the citizenship registries of each of our Métis governments, like I say, are objectively verifiable. They have been audited by third parties. Each of our Métis governments applies that 2002 definition of a Métis citizen that was passed by the Métis National Council. And if I may even read something that Métis lawyer Jean Taille has written recently for a report for the University of Saskatchewan, which emphasizes the strength of our Métis government registries. She wrote, "The Métis Nation has 5 regional provincial members: Métis Nation British Columbia, Métis Nation of Alberta, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, the Manitoba Métis Federation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. Each of these provincial organizations have a reliable registry that the University of Saskatchewan can utilize. Because these registries require objective evidence for citizenship to be granted, cards that are up to date and issued by them can be accepted with no further quest for information." So that is written by Métis lawyer Jean Taille for the University of Saskatchewan, while we're all working to fight identity fraud in these institutions for individuals taking opportunities away from Métis people. Again, speaks volumes to the strength of our Métis registries.
Thank you for that. And I was having a conversation with a Métis professor, a friend of mine, Larry Chartrand, and he had also talked about the thorough process of going through who's on these lists, and also that there's further work being done to evaluate. Could you speak to us a little bit about what that process looks like?
So there is an internal process that the Métis National Council has been mandated to implement. That is through a 2021 resolution from our General Assembly. That has, again, I just want to make it clear, nothing to do with what's in this piece of legislation. It's really important. Who belongs to the Métis Nation is for the Métis Nation to decide. And therefore, we have implemented our own process that has been directed through our own democratic institutions, and we will be following that direction from our General Assembly, from our democratic institutions, because Métis people are self-determining. And so I think that's what I'll say about that.
So within the definition, it has a certain part of it. It says, is distinct from other Aboriginal peoples, which I'm assuming meaning First Nations and Inuit. So when we're talking about the definition from the Métis National Council, a lot of people have said, well, some chiefs have come here and said, well, these aren't Métis, they're former First Nations. What your definition actually means is that they would have to be connected to a distinct Métis community like the Red River Métis. In order to satisfy that, they couldn't just be having mixed ancestry from another First Nation to qualify as Métis. Is that a correct reading of that motion?
Citizenship is for Section 35 Métis rights holders. So yes, so communities that meet the definition, the criteria of a historical Métis community that has Section 35, that's correct.
So just to be crystal clear, to dispel any myths or misconceptions or erroneous statement we've heard here, being Métis is not about mixed ancestry with First Nations, it's about distinct communities. Is that correct?
Métis does not mean mixed.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, well, you want to expand on that? I think that was a very thorough
Sure.
and...
Sure. I'll even talk more about the strength of our Métis registries in that that you have to be distinct from. Many of our Métis registries actually use a system that kind of audits our Métis registries against INAC's registry for status First Nations to make sure that there is no overlap, that there is separate and beyond. And when we say that they are objectively verifiable, that they have been audited, there are a number of processes that we could show you to show you the strength of our Métis registries. But once again, it's so important for us to say here that as an Indigenous nation, we have the right to determine who our citizens are. We have the right to determine who belongs, and that is a right that the Métis Nation holds.
20 seconds. Okay.
Thank you for your testimony.
you.
Appreciate
Good. Thank you. We're now going to go to Madame Verubé. Bienvenue.
Merci.
Et, vous avez 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes, Madame Berube. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank you for coming to our committee, Madame Caron. You spoke about reconciliation surrounding C-53. The First Nations are talking about getting away from these attempts at reconciliation. How do you interpret that?
I'm going to ask just for clarification on the question. You're asking First Nations are trying to move away from reconciliation? Sorry? Just seeking clarification.
S'oppose.
Yes. Or they are opposed to reconciliation.
That's a really interesting question. I know that reconciliation means many different things to many different people. It means different things to different communities. It means different things to each one of our citizens. There are different processes that people consider to be part of reconciliation. It has, of course, been a buzzword of recent governments, and it presents the opportunity to build a relationship, to move forward in a good way. Bill C-53 can be interpreted as reconciliation in action as we are moving towards the recognition of Métis rights, the implementation of Métis rights, something that our communities, our people, our leaders, our citizens have been working towards for generations. So some can say that it fits within the box of reconciliation. Others would say that it is just the right thing to do. And whether or not you label it reconciliation or not is up to the individual. For First Nations to decide that they want to move away from using the term reconciliation, that's up to them to do that as well. And I wouldn't force anybody to use a word that they are uncomfortable using.
Also, some Métis communities oppose to this bill. So what would you say to these communities who oppose the act?
Absolutely. Métis people have the right to choose. Again, this bill is only about the 3 Métis governments that are named in it, and Métis citizens have the right to choose who represents them. I think that is something that is very important to say. Métis people really do value democracy. We know that Métis people have the right to choose that, and in our instance, for the 4 Métis governments that comprise the Métis National Council, that totals about 160,000 registered Métis citizens who choose those governments to represent them. We know, of course, there is opposition in certain provinces, say perhaps in Alberta, but it's important to recognize that 65,000 registered Métis citizens choose the Métis Nation of Alberta to represent them as their government. And we stand firm that everybody has the right to choose, and this is the pathway that our Métis governments are taking to implement, and we hope to see this piece of legislation fulfill that promise that has been promised to us for the past 40 years and talked about for generations before.
Additionally, could you talk about the impact of passing this bill in your communities?
would love to. So as I said in my introduction, my family comes from St. Louis and Batoche, Saskatchewan. So I live in Ontario right now. I cannot be represented by the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. Once the self-government agreements are fully implemented, I would then have the right to choose the Métis Nation Saskatchewan to represent me as my government, because those are my homelands. My family comes from a really historic part of the Métis Nation homeland. My family contributed to so much history, as the chair mentioned, the Batoche National Historic Site. The one homestead that still stands on those protected grounds is the homestead of my great-great-grandfather, and those lands are so sacred to the Métis because those are the lands where our ancestors fought, what I said in my introduction, for what we are still fighting for today, to preserve the Métis way of life, to govern our people in the way that we know they want to be governed, to take care of our people in the way that we can take care of them, to take care of our children in ways that we know how to take care of our children. And so this piece of legislation is moving us forward in a way that we have not yet been able to do, and it would be making history, it would be setting things right, and it would be truly meaningful to me as a Métis woman, and I know to my family and to my ancestors as well.
Yeah, 12 seconds. Okay, merci.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Idlut, and when you're ready, you'll have the floor for 6 minutes.
Kayan namik sa Batalik, and kayan namik to the witnesses for coming here today. I'm very excited to have you. I'm very much of the view that just like First Nations and Inuit, Métis do have a right to self-determination. And I think that this bill attempts to recognize that right, so that as self-governing nations, you're also the nations that will be recognized in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta will be able to make laws that impact their peoples. I completely understand that. We've also, as a committee, have been hearing a lot of concerns about First Nations and other Métis rights being infringed if this bill were to pass. So I'm going to be asking just a few questions to help maybe educate us more about what this bill could mean. So, for example, I understand that the three Métis nations, as well as you had mentioned earlier, that you believe in UNDRIP, and that it's a good thing that UNDRIP is included in this bill. Have you read Article 19 of UNDRIP?
I'm sure I have. I just don't know them off my heart, but I've got it right here with me.
I'll read it very quickly. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. And this is an important article, and you've talked about the duty to consult, which is a standard that you say hasn't been reached yet. But if you believe in UNDRIP, do you think that Article 19 is being implemented during this process?
I absolutely do, because what's really important about Article 19 is that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith on the measures that will affect them. This piece of legislation only affects Métis governments that are named within this piece of legislation. Since Bill C-53 does not impact or affect other Indigenous peoples, there was no trigger required for Canada to consult with anybody else on it. It's really important to know that it only affects those three Métis governments and the collectivities that those three Métis governments are comprised of. And that's exactly what Article 19 is doing, and I do think that this bill has met Article 19 of UNDRIP.
Okay. What would you say to the First Nations and to other Métis settlements who say that their rights are potentially being infringed, and whether they felt that their Article 19 rights have been respected?
I would say, first and foremost, I hope that those individuals saying those things have read the legislation and have read the self-government agreements that were signed by our Métis governments and Canada, because not only within the legislation it says that it is only affecting those three Métis governments, within the self-government agreements as well, there are clauses that say that these agreements will have no effect on anybody else except these Métis governments. For example, even within the Métis Nation of Alberta's self-government agreement, there is a clause in there that says the title is no effect on Alberta Métis settlements. There are clauses within these agreements already that state that these will have no effect on them. So essentially what I say there is that there has been, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation that has been shared throughout this committee process, and Kianamik for always asking the hard questions about, show me in the legislation where it will have an effect on people that are not in this legislation, because that's what's really important here. This legislation only impacts those three Métis governments, and there are clauses that say that it will not affect anybody else.
In the bill, in Section 8, on page 4, there is a sentence in here that says the Government of Canada recognizes that a Métis government set out in column 1 of the schedule is an Indigenous governing body that is authorized to act on behalf of the Métis collectivity set out in column 2. The part that I want to ask you about is the question of whether those identified in that schedule are authorized. How would you help support whether they are authorized, knowing that there are Métis settlements in places like Alberta that might dispute that?
I'm going to just wait for council here to clarify this. That's what I was going to say anyways. Citizens have the right to choose who represents them. Once again, if I was a Métis person living in Alberta and I chose for the Métis Nation of Alberta to not represent me, then I wouldn't register for citizenship within them. The self-government agreements, this piece of legislation only affects the Métis governments and the collectivities of those who choose to be a part of those collectivities. So the individuals, the communities that choose to be outside are not affected. Kianamik.
Okay, that takes us to the end of the first round. We're going to go into a slightly shorter and faster second round. And first up, I have Mr. Vidal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, President, for being here today and for the conversation. I know you've been following the proceedings very closely of what's been going on over the last several weeks, and you've heard the concerns. We spoke quite a bit about the Chiefs of Ontario and some of those concerns in Northern Ontario. I want to talk a little bit more about what my colleague Ms. Idlu talked about, though, and the concerns that are being raised by other Métis groups, both the MMF and the Métis settlements and the folks from Alberta. We haven't heard a lot from Saskatchewan, but in some of these other communities. And maybe let me start with just framing this as the national president that represents all of these organizations or Métis people in the country. I want to give you an opportunity to just maybe offer your comments on what the concern is for you, kind of in the divide between your own people, between your own community, so to speak, of what that means to you.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And I come back to the democratic right to choose. The democratic right to choose who represents you, to vote for who represents you, to be a part of a collectivity who represents you, and always the right to choose. That is our democratic right. Again, Métis people value democracy. As the president of the Métis National Council, what's really important here is to recognize the Métis National Council is not a Métis government. We are comprised of Métis governments, and those Métis governments have been comprised of citizens and leaders who have been organizing for generations, who have been doing this work for generations for so long, and have been acting as governments for our people up until this point. Those those governments were the ones who came together in 1983, 40 years ago, to say that we need a national voice at the national level, the international level, and created the Métis National Council. And so I get my direct mandate from them. It's really important for me to explain that once again. Métis National Council is not a Métis government. We are comprised of Métis governments, and those Métis governments are the ones who represent the Section 35 rights of Métis citizens. And again, we always have the right to choose.
Thank you. I don't want to cut you off, but I'm very limited here. I'm going to comment back. You can maybe make a quick comment, but I want to get to one more question. One of my concerns in that concept of the right to choose, and I was out in northern Saskatchewan last week, to be honest with you, talking to people in a number of Métis communities, and one of the concerns about the right to choose is that if I have the right to choose but I choose not to, I'm not going to qualify for some of the health benefits and some of those kinds of things that are going to be part of the self-government recognition. It comes with funding for providing health benefits and some of those Section 35 rights. So if I choose not to be represented by one of the provincial Métis organizations, my right to choose means I don't have access to some of those benefits. So can you give me as quick a comment as you can in response to that, because I really do want to get to one more question.
We can talk about this, but once again, this legislation only talks about internal self-government, how the Métis governments are administered.
But in fairness, President, you're talking about the individual having the right to choose who represents them in the context of the Métis settlements compared to the MNA in this case. So, you know, that is a concern. And I don't want to get into a debate with you because I really want to get one more question in. So maybe you and I can chat later a little bit or something. We had the MMF here a few weeks ago, and I'm sure you were watching. In the context of some of the concerns they raised, they made a comment, which I think we're all aware of, but that they're kind of in final stages of treaty negotiations with the Government of Canada for MMF. My question is actually pretty simple. I'm just curious for your response to what happens if Bill C-53 doesn't get passed, but the MMF treaty does. What does that mean to MNC and the three organizations that we're talking about in this legislation?
So what's really important to note here is that there is no one way to move towards self-government, and I think that is exactly what is being demonstrated here. One Métis government moving towards self-government in one way, and three Métis governments choosing to move towards self-government in another way. What we're here to do is to talk about the implementation legislation, and I think that this is, there has been a precedent set for this process previously, where First Nations have opted to use this process, where legislation comes first and treaty negotiations come second. That has been done successfully, and I'll reference it for the committee, but it is the Yukon First Nation agreement, and I think it's really important to know that this process is not new, and it's the option that our Métis governments have chosen to use.
I think he's going to cut me off about right now. Thank you, Chair.
Great, thank you. We'll now go to, where's my list? Ms. Atwin, you get 5 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for being here, President Caron. It's always great to have you at committee. I would love to ask, you know, the majority of voices that we're hearing, you know, in support of the bill or just clarifying it for us are women. Why do you think that is?
I love that question. Thank you so much. Women have played a significant role in the development and the forward movement of the Métis Nation throughout our history. You know, it's really important that we recognize the roles that Métis women have played historically throughout the Métis Nation. Throughout history textbooks, we know a lot about Louis Riel. Some of us know about Gabriel Dumont, but we don't know about the women behind the scenes who were involved in the conversations, who were involved in taking care of the nation behind closed doors. Today, women are taking seats in leadership roles. I am the first elected woman to hold the president of the Métis National Council, and our General Assembly is comprised of at least 50%, if not more, women. It's just women have this ability to see beyond themselves, to see where we need to go in the future, and this bill is exactly that. It's where we need to go in the future for the Métis Nation, and I would just imagine that a lot of our women see this as a positive step forward for the Métis Nation.
And I guess my other favorite subject to talk about is youth. So how do you see youth being involved in the implementation of the provisions in this legislation?
Anywhere and everywhere they want to be involved. I got my start as a youth leader within the Métis National, or at the Métis National Council as well. I played a role, but it was only last month that we actually implemented a national Métis Youth Council. Métis youth play a huge role in the Métis Nation's governance. Louis Riel was only 24 when he first took his seat as president of the first provisional government. Young people have played such a significant role in the Métis Nation, and if I may just take this time to thank those Métis youth who have come to this committee and so bravely testified to share their stories and to fight for the Métis Nation. That's what they're doing. They are the ones who are not only the leaders of the future, they're the leaders of now. They see where this is going, and I just have so much gratitude for those young people who have so bravely sat here and testified to this committee on this bill.
Excellent. In 2013, the Supreme Court of Canada, they commented on the need for reconciliation with Métis Nation, stating the unfinished business of reconciliation of the Métis people with Canadian sovereignty is a matter of national and constitutional importance. Can you speak to the impacts that the long history of Métis denialism and the historic reluctance to acknowledge the existence of Métis as a nation, rights-bearing Indigenous group, have had on your people?
Yeah, and in my opening statement, I referenced a lot of those pieces where there have been promises made to Métis people to implement Section 35 for the last 40 years. Since the constitutional conferences, Métis leader Jim Sinclair, when those ultimately failed, said, this is not the end, this is just the beginning. My people will be back. We are back. We are here to continue to pursue this fight, to implement self-government, to do the right thing. It is a matter of constitutional import. This is the unfinished business of Confederation. Métis people have played a historic and a significant role in this country, and it's time for our people to take what is theirs and to move forward in the best way possible.
Thanks. I feel, hopeful and kind of positive about this process. But initially we thought it would be a bit more simple. We thought we'd be able to move forward a little bit faster. And because, we see the government is here at the table, seeking to truly be a partner with this co-developed legislation. But again, we have heard from a lot of voices that also have concerns, particularly in First Nation leadership. And so I'm looking for guidance, really. Why do you think that is? Why I would characterize it, there's some fear. There's some anger associated with it as well. So if you could help us kind of negotiate this, why do you think that is?
Because of colonialism, quite frankly. I think one of our young people spoke to this quite well during a previous hearing where she said that through colonialism, through colonial policies and practices, our people have been pitted against each other. I think it's really important to know that there is not one pie that we are all taking from. Métis rights are not derivative from First Nations rights. They do not take away from anybody's rights. We have these rights, and because this is new, it is scary. However, it's not new. We've been talking about this for 40 years, and I'd love to continue to talk about this, but it's not new. There's not one pie. It is not taking away from.
Thank you. We're going to go now to Madame Berube for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. There is a lot of talk about legitimacy. This seems to be a major issue. What would you answer the members of your community that are questioning the legitimacy of the groups MNA, MNS?
I would refer to our objectively verifiable registries, the processes, the strict processes and policies that are in place for citizenship. Again, making it clear that citizenship is something that is self-determined by the nation. That is a right of our Métis, the Métis Nation. But again, all of these pieces have been promised through different processes. It has been affirmed in the courts. The Supreme Court of Canada recognizes that there is at least one Section 35 rights-bearing Métis community in Ontario, and that's what this legislation is about, is self-government for these Métis governments.
Les Premières Nations.
First Nations that testified before the committee often said that there was a lack of adequate consultation. What do you think of this argument?
Once again, this legislation is only about the three Métis governments. The three Métis governments, how they govern themselves, how they run their elections, how they take care of their children. What is in this legislation did not trigger any duty to consult with First Nations because it does not affect anybody outside of these three Métis governments and the collectivities.
Vous avez parlé.
You also spoke about legitimacy earlier. I think it's a very important concept. You're talking about yourselves as Métis people, but what are the arguments? In what ways is this bill positive for you?
This bill is the culmination of the last 40 years of implementing the promise of Section 35 to Métis. There have been, as I stated, from 1982 up until just this past 2003, many promises that tell us that we are going to get there. We are going to get there and we are going to achieve self-government, which is an inherent right to the Métis Nation. But time and time again, one of our Métis rights lawyers talks about Charlie Brown and Lucy when they are going to play football, and Charlie Brown goes to kick the football and Lucy pulls the football away, and Charlie Brown falls on his bum, and that has been what has happened to the Métis Nation over the past 40 years. We get so close to implementing all of this work, and then we get Lucied, as is said, and it gets taken away from us. And so this piece of legislation is something that that is necessary for us to continue to move forward, and we really do hope that we don't get Lucied on this piece of legislation.
Okay, that's the end of the 2.5 minutes. Next to Ms. Idlut for her 2.5 minutes.
Chair. I understand that back in September 2021, the MMF withdrew its membership with MNC over its concerns about application of the citizenship criteria. So I wonder if you could help try to dispel some of the myths about citizenship, because if a strong organization like MMF is saying that they challenge citizenship criteria, and you're talking about the legitimacy of it and the objectively verifiable mechanisms that are being used, I wonder if you could take this time to help explain what it is that you actually do, so that you can help dispel some of those misunderstandings that exist right now.
So I just want to once again say that all of our Métis governments apply the 2002 definition of Métis citizen that has been voted on and approved by the Métis National Council. The processes that are implemented, each of our Métis governments have their own citizenship registries. They have their processes to ensure that all of the genealogy and the documents that are required to meet that definition and to become a Métis citizen, that is done within each of our Métis governments. The auditing processes that have taken place include the Canadian Standards Association auditing those Métis registries and the processes, and then just once again want to highlight that that the work that Jean Taille has done in the report for the University of Saskatchewan to highlight how strong these Métis registries are, and I would recommend that the committee take a look at that report as well.
very quickly, one of the other concerns that has been brought to me is that this is a form of identity theft, and I wonder if you could help explain that it's not.
It's just not. I mean, Métis people are recognized as one of the three Indigenous peoples within Section 35. There is Métis, there is First Nations, and there is Inuit. We know who we are. We know where we come from. We have a history. We have rights. We are the Métis Nation, and this piece of legislation simply affirms the right to self-government for these three Métis governments, which have been around, some of them for close to 100 years doing this work.
And colleagues, we do have time for the final part of this round, which is a 5-minute for this side and a 5 minutes for this side. So we'll jump right now to Mr. Schmale, who will go with the 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to split my time with Gary Vidal. So President Caron, if you don't want to deal with him, just feel free to talk about your answers. I just want to drill back down to what Gary was talking about in terms of the benefits and how that associates with the membership in, say, Saskatchewan, as he heard from his members in northern Saskatchewan. Do you understand that to be true, that if you were not part of, say, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, that there could be some questions in terms of getting some of the benefits that are owed?
So first and foremost, Bill C-53 is not about benefits. Bill C-53 is about the internal governance of these Métis governments. Citizens have the opportunity to choose who represents them, to choose who delivers programs and services to them. If an individual is satisfied with the governmental structure of the federal government, the provincial government that currently represents them, and they choose not to register as a Métis citizen of Saskatchewan, that is their choice. If they choose to be represented by the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, again, that is their choice.
Okay, so just to clarify, say they are in for Alberta, they belong to Métis settlements, it doesn't matter which one. They choose not to join Métis Nation Alberta. I know it's not about benefits, but if Métis Nation Alberta is the governing body or the one that deals with the majority of Métis in Alberta, would there be risk that those belonging only to a settlement would lose their benefits?
No, because
Okay, no.
there is no pie that if the Métis Nation of Alberta is not taking 3/4 of this pie and the settlements are taking this quarter of the pie, there are different ways and different approaches to do just that. It's important, again, to reference Section 15.05 of the MNA's self-government agreement that says nothing in this agreement impacts or affects the rights, jurisdictions, powers, or responsibilities of the Métis Settlements General Council or a Métis settlement, including the ownership of Métis settlement land recognized in Alberta's Métis Settlement Act.
Okay,
it's in there.
I just needed clarification, just because we
Absolutely.
weren't sure, but I appreciate that. I'm going to yield my time to Gary Vidal.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm going to come at this one more time because I want to be certain, President. I spoke to people in Saskatchewan last week that told me when we talk about Section 35 rights in the context of health, for example, okay, health benefits. If you're a member of a First Nation and you have to receive dialysis, for example, in the city of Saskatoon and you live in northern Saskatchewan, you have travel benefits, you have some of these other things through the appropriate programs. As a Métis individual in northern Saskatchewan, you are covered by Saskatchewan Health. But the MNS is looking to add benefits that would be the same for travel if you have to go for dialysis, those kinds of benefits. But they say that they would not receive those unless they chose to be a member of the MNS in this case. So you kind of hear where I'm coming from, right? I just like the rights and privileges or the right to choose your membership is less than a free right if you're kind of have a gun held to your head in the sense of some of the benefits that you now are they misunderstanding this? I guess that would be the other option. Are they understanding the truth of this? I'll let you clarify that.
I don't think I can answer that question, quite honestly, because it's hard to comprehend. I'm going to Saskatchewan right after this. I'd love to find those individuals and have that conversation with them so that I could potentially clarify that with them. But once again, members, I want to redirect you to the legislation, what is in this legislation, what is not in this legislation. Benefits are not in this legislation right now. And I would love to talk to you about the fact that Métis Nation does not even have health benefits right now. We do not have health benefits, non-insured health benefits, but this committee has actually provided a recommendation to government to negotiate health benefits for the Métis Nation, and we look forward to a time when that happens, but at this point in time, this legislation does not talk about benefits, and it is just about the internal governance of these three Métis governments, and I just continue to urge this committee to remember what is in and what is not in this piece of legislation.
Thank you. Very quickly, because I think I'm nearly out of time. This has taken a long time. It started back in 2018. There's been a long process. It's got delayed many times through many processes. Can you just speak to the delays? Maybe just like what do you think has caused all these delays from 2018 to when the legislation finally got introduced in June of 23?
And I'd say briefly a couple of sentences, and then we do need to move to our final questions.
The recognition that this piece of legislation has been longer delayed than just since 2018. It has been delayed since 1982. Once again, simply put, it is time.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll go to Mr. Batiste for the final 5 minutes of this panel.
Thank you for that, and I know those questions kind of blurred the lines between Section 35 rights and 9124 rights and Indian Act rights in a way that it was really tough to answer. But to the best of your reading of this legislation, does this legislation at all talk about any of those rights that people are saying that are a pie that's going to be split, or is there any kind of discussion of those Section 35 rights that have not been actually proven by the courts in various court cases?
No, and again, I want to refer the members to each of the Métis self-government agreements. Nothing in this agreement or the implementation legislation extinguishes, defines, creates, modifies, limits, prejudices, restricts, or surrenders any Métis right.
One of the things that, that people often talk, sometimes we come into committee and we think that we hold Indigenous people to a higher standard than we hold our own democracies. I mean, we have our own people we have our opposition, we have, multiple oppositions, and as Métis leaders, there's going to be disputes and disagreements. But throughout this process, we've talked a lot about how Canada moves forward with this once agreements are done. Can you talk to me about the ratification process that might be coming for the Métis on how they would ratify these agreements internally?
No, I can't speak to that, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand that it's probably a question that I should have asked the governments themselves, that they all have their own, but would you say that there is a ratification process in place for when these treaties come to some kind of conclusion, that it would not just be the Canadian government who looks at this, but also the Métis themselves in those areas?
Oh, for the treaties, yes, absolutely. There will be ratification of the treaties by our people who choose to be represented by those governments.
Yes, and so those discussions of people who are saying we're not involved, we're not a part of this, if they choose to have a voice and if they choose to use their voice as they can in democratic methods, that they will be heard, and at some point, even those who aren't on board that are Métis will have that ability to voice that through a process.
Métis people will have a voice through the ratification process. If the treaties impact others' rights, those will be consulted on. I want to even talk about the ratification processes that have taken place up until this date. The Métis Nation of Alberta went through a process of developing their constitution for their Otopomiswak Métis government. And they went to a ratification of their 65,000 Métis citizens in the province of Alberta, and 97% of voters voted in favor of ratifying that constitution. Métis people are very civically engaged. Métis people love democracy. They will vote if they want to vote. They will have a say if they want to have a say. And the ratification of the Constitution in Alberta, the Métis Nation of Alberta, is a prime example of what just took place there.
So in a quick minute that I have, can you talk a little bit about how Métis script, what is Métis script and how that came along? 1 minute.
No, I'm sorry, Jaime, Mr.
John, do I get
Batiste.
extra
I'm not
time?
going to talk about script in 1 minute. Also, just because it does not have anything to do with this legislation. But love to go for coffee with you and talk about the script system and future processes to settle those historic grievances. Because what's important to note here is that this legislation does not provide for those methods to settle those historic grievances.
Well, I knew that was a challenge, but I thought you go for it. Anyway, John, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Stop the clock there. Thank you, President, so much for your time, for being here, and to Ms. Winterburn for joining us. Colleagues, we're going to suspend now. We need to switch to the next panel, including a quick sound check for Mr. Abrams. So, Mr. Abrams, if you're ready to go, we'll get your camera on, and the clerk will be in touch with you. But colleagues, for the next minute or two, we're going to suspend, and we'll pull you back in as quickly as we can get the sound check done. We're suspended. and is the Regional Director for the Métis Nation of British Columbia. So, Mr. Gladu, wonderful to have you here. And when you're ready to start, we'll turn the floor over to you for your 5-minute opening statement.
Good evening. My name is Dean Gladu. I am Métis. I was born in Dawson Creek in northeastern British Columbia and was raised in a Métis community known as Mogston Flats, that is currently known as Chetwynd. My parents are Bill and Blanche Gladu, née Desjardins. My father's Métis parents are Louis Gladu and Madeleine Gladu, née Labucan and Lafreniere. My mother's Métis parents are Joseph Desjardins and Helen Desjardins, née Belcourt. My family has been generations of Métis people marrying Métis people. I'm proud to be Métis, as enshrined in the Constitution of Canada. Thank you for your invitation to appear as a witness today. I open today with one statement and one call to Canada. I support the self-determination of the Métis government members of the Métis National Council, Métis Nation Alberta, Métis Nation Saskatchewan, and Métis Nation Ontario. I am optimistic that Bill C-53 establishes a pathway for self-determination of Métis in British Columbia. Today I'm thinking of my ancestors and all the things they would want to say. My family continues to practice our language, Neo. We speak the language, and culture. We practice our culture very intently. To this day, I'm a son, grandson, great-grandson, brother, uncle, cousin, and many cousins, as we know in the Indigenous world, lots of cousins. My family lived on road allowances. My mother attended residential school, and I was almost scooped out of my family at the hospital shortly after being born. I carry teachings of what it means to be Métis to the people who govern themselves, of the resistance. This was passed to me from my grandfather, my Musum, Louis Gladu. He shared what his Musum said, his grandpa said. I served 26 years also in the RCMP with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And since 2017, I have served as an elected leader and the minister with the Métis Nation of BC. Every generation of my family has been involved with the Métis Nation and its movement since 1816. I do this work because Métis people are struggling. I see it in my own family. Métis voices are limited. Even the next generation, we are seeing that. The policies of Canada and its provinces are still negatively impacting us. This is the outcome of Canada not recognizing Métis rights to self-government. I carry my Métis laws with me, my right to care for my children, to speak my language, Neona, to practice my culture, my right to identify as Métis and to be claimed by a Métis family and nation. I have a right to be supported by Métis society and Métis government. I am still Métis here in front of you today. My Métis government, Métis Nation BC, submitted a brief on Bill C-53, which also supports this bill and calls on Canada to see the bill as a pathway to self-govern for MNBC. Bill C-53 is Canada upholding the right of self-governance for our fellow governing members. For you to truly uphold UNDRIP, Canada must recognize the history and cultural practice that all Métis in Canada, including Section 35 right-holding Métis living in BC. I am sharing the Cree word. Also, it's a very well-known word in the Métis word, in the Métis culture, Otipimwasawik, which means people who govern themselves, and you heard it earlier with President Caron. Métis people have always had our laws, our ways of organizing ourselves, distinct Métis societies, recognition of Métis governance is key to recognition of our rights. Métis are highly mobile through cultural practices and livelihood. We're also a displaced people due to colonial practices such as the residential schools and 60 school. Métis laws, cultural governments, and jurisdiction over our families were intentionally disrupted and silenced. Outcomes of Canada's laws and policies, for example, our children and the government continues to deny our jurisdiction over our children. To this day, Métis people live in fear. Their children will be taken away by the government. And once Métis children are gone without recognized Métis government, the individual families must fight to learn where their children are. The inability of Canada to enter into government-to-government agreements with MNBC has caused this. My story, my family's story, shared in part here with you today is an example of our Métis laws and practice. I believe that some of my family members are still alive because of my parents exercising their Métis rights. My family knows that we need a Métis nation, a Métis government to advocate with the provincial and federal governments to respect our laws. and culture and our Métis-specific services. My family worked with Métis Nation BC to create Naomi's Principle in recognition of my niece, Naomi. When we lose a life because of Canada or BC's policies, it affects us deeply and emotionally. This is hard to talk about, but it must be talked about because you must understand the effects of colonial government. We are creating Naomi's Principle because of the continued loss of life due to the lack of Métis cultural safe wellness services. We must ensure that BC is a safe place for Métis to be Métis. Building relationships and transformation and reconciliation is possible. Métis are doing this every day. I hope this bill gets passed, that my Métis brothers and sisters in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario are recognized by Canada. Bill C-53 is a step forward on the path of reconciliation. My hope is that you also realize and understand that Métis and British Columbia are missing from this legislation, that we have been forgotten, and we've been known as the forgotten people for over 100 years. Our rights must be recognized and respected. Thank you, merci, all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your opening statement. Colleagues, we do have Grand Chief Joel Abram back from the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians. I'm going to have to suspend while we do just a very brief sound quality check, and we'll be returning, and then Grand Chief Abram will get into your opening statement right away. But for the moment, we're suspended. Resumed. The quality is right on the edge of where we need it to be. So I'd say just speak very clearly, slowly. If we need to push the 5 minutes to allow that, we will, not a lot beyond. And for both Mr. Gladue and yourself, I use a card system. 30 seconds is the yellow card left in the allotment we have, and then the red card is we're out of time, but so don't stop mid-sentence, just wind up your thought, and then we'll move on to the next person. Okay. And now that we're back in session, I just say there's no screenshots, no photos, and but when you're ready, Ms. Grand Chief Abram, the floor is yours for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. My name is Joel Abram. I'm the Grand Chief of the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, whose 7 member nations include Batchewana First Nation, Alnapawi or Delaware Nation, Caldwell First Nation, Wata Mohawks, Oneida Nation of the Thames, Hiawatha First Nation, and Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Altogether, we advocate for approximately 20,000 First Nation citizens. I am here today to speak of our strong concerns that this bill will irreparably destabilize the foundation of Canada's relations with our member nations. Our member nations affirm their sovereignty, founded in the responsibilities provided to their respective nations by the Creator. The member nations have their own constitutionalism and self-determination, including pre-existing laws that governed over treaty relationships, and they are steadfast that they cannot surrender their sovereignty, territory, or way of life. We stand united in our opposition of Bill C-53, and I am here to ask you to kill the bill. We cannot be idle when this Métis Nation claim sovereign rights in our territories in southern, central, and northeastern Ontario. Bill C-53 is another example of the Canadian government's attempt to assimilate and subjugate our peoples. It ignores our inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights and prioritizes Métis rights in lands they have no Indigenous claim to. In 1969, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau introduced the 1969 Statement of the Government of Canada and Indian Policy, more commonly known as the White Paper. It proposed eradicating the special legal status of Indians in this country. The result was a First Nations uprising and uproar that put an end to that policy. This is the beginning of AIAI, a shared commitment to our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples. We are actively participating in a similar response to Bill C-53, hoping to achieve the same result. Because it seems Bill C-53 has the same endgame, eradicating the meaning of the special status we are recognized as having in your Constitution. We are widely known as a First Nation organization that takes to the streets to organize its demonstrations when Canada goes too far. Section 35.2 is not a colonial equalizer of rights, and our member nations are still called Indians alongside Métis and Inuit, but this does not erase the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, or Anishinaabe nations' very unique and special relationship with Canada. Co-equal First Nation, Métis, and Inuit policy continues the harm and damage of the Indian Act. We have communities and nations to heal and revitalize. The Métis run up the middle with equity, seeking funding they do not deserve, in municipalities that have clean drinking water, well-funded schools, and first world infrastructure. But more specifically in Bill C-53, by recognizing Section 35 rights of groups who do not actually have that unique constitutional status, thereby watering down the significance of that recognition. This is a assimilation all over again through a slightly different angle. Our nations have treaty relationships that existed before Confederation. At no time did we recognize or have kinship relations with this distinct and separate Métis communities, let alone nations in our territories. It is that simple. They did not exist at the requisite time they would need to in order to have an inherent right to self-government in territories near or adjacent to our nations. However, our nations must deal with these organizations, the Métis Nation of Ontario and their collectives within municipalities in southern, central, and northern Ontario. And this legislation will make their questionable and illegitimate claims real, while our inherent and treaty rights will become subservient. We were your military allies before Confederation. We are key treaty partners that shared our territories for the settlement of southern, central, and northeastern Ontario. Canada's history could have been a much different one without these important treaty relationships in the 18th and 19th centuries. Bill C-53 grants rights to a Métis collectivity, not because it meets the criteria in a Métis right to self-government analysis, but because its name is added to column 2 in a schedule. We are going so far beyond poly with this legislation. Our lawyers inform us that differential treatment has always been part of the honor of the Crown and the Crown policy of our Aboriginal rights. And ignoring these doctrines is to undermine the significance of Section 35 for nations who hold inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights based on sacred relationships to our homelands and adherence to the law. This is assimilation all over again. Not only does C53 promote assimilation by ignoring Section 35 analysis, it also subjugates our member nations in their jurisdiction to that of this modern treaty contemplated in this legislation. Section 7 of Bill C53 states that a Métis treaty would take precedence over any inconsistent provisions of the bill or of any piece of federal legislation. This includes existing First Nation treaty implementation legislation and means that the implementation of a legitimate First Nations treaties would take a back seat to the implementation of the Métis Nation of Ontario's treaty in event of any conflict.
Great. Thank you for your opening statement, Grand Chief Abram. We're going to go right into our first round of questions, and for 6 minutes, first up I have Mr. Zimmer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for our witnesses for appearing today. My questions will be for Dean Gladue. We've known each other for many years, Dean, and I've always known you to be a difference maker. First as a hockey player inspiring young kids from Chetwynd back in the day, then as an RCMP officer, but now as a regional director for Métis Nation BC. You said something to me that really stuck with me many years ago. Blessed are the peacemakers, Dean. And I see you continuing with that call on your life today in Ottawa this time. And we've had conversations about what being Métis means to you. And so what I want to ask you about, for the sake of the committee, what does it mean for you to be Métis, to be respected and recognized as Métis, Dean?
That's a good question. It's a deep question for me because all I know is being Métis. And all of my parents know, my Muslim, my grandfather, as far as Cuthbert Grant and beyond, I'm a direct descendant of that. We've known to be who we are. We've known that we've had issues with Canada throughout our history. We've created our own language. We have our own distinct culture and language. We came from of generations of European and First Nations descent. And as a result, we established our own ways and laws. And we've always practiced our own ways and laws. I was raised as a road allowance kid. I was born in '66, and I was also taken almost by the 60 scoop within minutes. My family, because I had an uncle who can read English, was able to say, no, Moya, they're going to take him away. They're going to steal him. They knew that we were having children stealing from hospitals throughout Canada, and especially also Métis children. My mother was a residential school victim as well, which I didn't even know till 1993, because she wouldn't talk about it, the impacts. So the impacts and policies of Canada definitely affect us deeply and immensely and continue to this day. And I wear this pin proudly as a Métis citizen and as a Métis person because, as they say, you will live and die for your belief. I will live and die for my belief. Neono instotin, we speak the language, we speak the culture. You go back home today and you see people still struggling. My very own family, Naomi's principal, who died of a drug overdose last year, who suffered through her mental illness and her issues and trying to get her the right help. Culturally sensitive weren't available. And as a result, she died in care. And we're going to say that. She was 22 years old. She died within a system that was colonial, built not for her success. So yes, I am here today to say that we are Métis people, and I stand strong about what we believe and what we do, and you need to know our story. And I call us the grassroots Métis, the ones in the trenches, the ones deep, who come from the resistance of 1885, who also understand the struggles we've had in this country. So I believe, as Section 35, we are rights holders, and I stay with that, and that's why I believe I am Métis.
Right, and Dean, and I know you say that as a proud Canadian. You said that as well as a proud Canadian and Métis at the same time.
100%. I want to finish with that. We are Canadian as well, and Métis is what Canada became about. We were here before Canada was even a confederation. Mm-hmm. It's about the mosaic. It's about a melting pot of Canada. Right. And it's our time to be heard and who we are. Right. And I'm a strong voice, I am. But to be a strong voice, I have to come through fire. I have to come through storms, and I have. Yeah. I have many scars on my face and my body to show that. But those are hockey scars. But I'm willing to go to battle even in that when I speak that, because I come from a family who knows who we are.
Yeah.
My grandfather said, "Napis ayapeote," he would say, "sit down. Never forget who you come from and who you are." I never knew what he meant by that until later in my life, because he had to struggle. And he says, we're the poor cousins in this country. Our First Nations brothers and sisters are being heard. We're not.
Right.
Thank you.
Well said, Dean. And I will add, you still play a bit of hockey once in a while at the odd tournament, hey? And knowing your mom and dad, they're special to me too. Dean and Bill and Blanche is people that just care for their neighbors in Chetwynd. They're just great folks. We spoke about, and you spoke about it in your testimony about the issues around Métis children and being disconnected from their families and in the system. And maybe can you explain that a little bit, what you meant by that? Because it's
first, yes, absolutely. Our Métis children right now in British Columbia, and I'll speak for British Columbia. I'm not here to speak on behalf of Canada and the whole bigger picture, but I do support my brothers and sisters in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and as well as in Ontario and Alberta. Métis children in British Columbia are the highest children in Indigenous kids in care right now. And we can stand behind that because we've been preaching that. Right now, we don't know where our children are in British Columbia. If our children were taken away, we have no idea if they're in culturally sensitive homes, who they are. We're still experiencing that. The last few suicides in care have been Métis children in British Columbia. We can know that. A good friend of mine, in fact, is one of his sons. He was put in a hotel because where does he go? It's the hot potato, we call it. First Nations don't want to handle it. Nobody wants to handle it. He's Métis, we can do this. But we need, that's why the culture. So, and us as police officers for 26 years, I saw the devastation of the ramifications of those policies. So I say our Métis, and because we don't have a self-government agreement in British Columbia, I believe these are still the consequences of the policies of Canada have been for over 100 years for us.
And I know, Dean, you have hope for a better
this,
future, but thanks for your testimony.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go now to Mr. Batiste. We'll have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Gladue, for your testimony today. Was it President Gladue or?
I'm known. I'm not the president. I'm a Region 3 director, Thompson Okanagan, which is the beautiful Okanagan in BC, and I'm a Minister of Sports and Active Living and Minister of Justice, as well as the Minister of Natural Resources. So I got a little bit of a portfolio there.
So for brevity, I'll call you Dean. How about that? Dean?
Call me Dean.
Okay.
Don't call me late for dinner.
That's a lot. Congratulations on all of those roles and the good work that you're doing in your community. I want to know a little bit more about the Métis of British Columbia, because I was interested. I was doing a little bit of research, and I saw in the citizenship application form that there is a lot of talk about the process and the year 1901 as an important portion of it, as well as part of your registration citizenship application. You require a 5-generation pedigree chart. Can you tell us more about the Métis of BC and your system of enrollment?
Well, I'm going to do the best I can in that regards. First of all, I'm not an expert in that. I can't really, so, things may be said in just, but I do know this, that we have one of the strictest genealogy enrollments in Canada. We have a very strict one. In fact, we went through a new process here recently, a process that we've identified some that are not of Métis descent and things that were flawed. And we're growing, and I say this is a new time and era for us. And, when I was playing junior hockey, when I played hockey years ago, we used to go to these native tournaments around Canada. And I recall guys showing up with a native, with a card. And we knew they were, because they're from my hometown, we know they're not. But they had a card because he got the local native team wanted him to play because he was, again, we're very competitive people. That was happening back in the day. In some ways, it's still happening, and we need to clean that up, and we need to know who are Neho, who are the real people. And in BC, we're doing that. We take that seriously, take that with pride. And we've been in BC for a lot of years. My family came to British Columbia because we were still nomadic. We were still running from the prairies. We were still running from the government in the late 50s. And that's why we came to a little town called Chetwynd and created what's called Moccasin Flats. We were still squatting land. And whenever we saw the government officials, I remember hiding in a tree, behind trees in the bush. Why? Nobody knew. but I knew later why. But you see, so when I say the impacts, we have very concern about who is going to be our Métis people. I played hockey the other day with a good friend of mine. He said, Dean, I'm a capital M, not a small M, meaning capital Métis to small Métis, you know. And I said, and we knew what he meant. He comes from the homeland. He comes from where we come from. We know. It's like, you know, you know who you are, and the families know who they are. The biggest challenge we have in BC is some of them are just starting to come home. A 75-year-old man named Phil Berlinski thought he was Polish all his life. And he passed. His mother passed many years ago. He just found out she comes from the Red River. So we're still finding ourselves. But in the meantime, some are trying to distinguish themselves as not being as Métis, but we know they're not. So we have a ways to go in our genealogy. That's why we hire the experts, to make sure that the right people are getting through the door. So, thank you.
Thank you for that. And, you know, can you talk a little bit about what the relationship is for the Métis BC to the Red River Métis it's
relationship?
Yes.
They're our cousins. They're our family. I myself come from the Chartrand family as well. I come from many Métis communities. I got 38 Métis connections. Everybody says whenever I go to Western Canada, I'm related to everybody. So whenever I went, that's why my wife is from South Africa. And we always joke about it, because you don't know, most times when I'm talking, I'm related. We are very well connected throughout the whole country. Anywhere I go in Western Canada especially, I'm related. And because I'm well involved in sports, even on the First Nation side, there's family. I'm of Iroquois descent as well. I come from the descent of Kurokwanki, through the Kellio and Belcourt clan, who are Iroquois. So we are interconnected in many different ways, and we're still interconnected. And we still practice our ceremonies and our laws. We have to, and so that's important to me. When I say, because I know how distinct differently we are from. And there are those Nehona, Moniaote, those Métis people that are just coming home, but they don't understand in the heart of what it means to be Métis yet, because they grew up in a colonial mentality of thinking. So I hope that helps.
That's very interesting. So when we're discussing this bill, it does not include the Métis of BC, but you're still in support. Can you tell me why?
Because they're our family, and they live there. Wherever I go in this world, I'm still Métis. But in Canada, they've built their culture in time, and we know that. And that's why I come here to support my brothers and sisters, because we're not just, if you live in a certain area, it doesn't mean you're Métis. If you are Métis as you move, and we have to prove our existence through evidence base.
So would you say that this legislation that's for the Métis would be a win for all Métis in Canada?
The capital M Métis, yes.
Okay.
Time there. We're going to go to Madame Berube, who's have 6 minutes.
You have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Gladu, congratulations.
Je vous remercie d'être.
Thank you. I would like to thank our two witnesses for being here at the committee. And I would like to thank you, Mr. Gladu, and congratulate you for everything you have become. I hope that someday you will write a book about your life. It should be a very interesting read. But for now, how does passing this bill contribute to reconciliation?
That last question sort of died off on me, if I can. For some reason, I can't hear the interpreter.
Pouvez-vous expliquer?
Can you explain how passing this legislation would contribute or promote reconciliation?
How this legislation will promote reconciliation is your question. Okay. Massively. It would make me feel part of Canada, a part of our growth, of what my ancestors always believed in, to being a part of what is Canada. Lou Riel, in his very essence, my grandfather, all believe that we want to build a future for our own children so that we can live in a good way. And then what happened throughout history, we got forgotten, especially after the resistance of 1885. We felt we were knocked off to the side. We were just existing, as they say. We were homeless, really. For 100 years, a lot of our people were homeless. And there's some are still homeless just because of economics and their lack of, there could be mental illness and other factors. My family have been the only one that owns a house, actually, to this day, within my siblings, that outright owns a house. Everybody else is still trying to find themselves. And that has to do with the fact that they just feel not heard at the government level. And I've seen it within the RCMP as a former officer, where a Métis would come in and say, oh, what band do you belong to? I don't belong to a band, I'm Métis. And I'd try to explain, oh, you're just one of us. Yes, I'm a Canadian, yeah, one of us is that, but I'm Métis. A Métis is a Métis is a Métis. And that's what I believe, is we are, but within the distinct of what is all of Canada. And we need to know that our history is there. We can't lose that. Losing a language is genocide. And we're fighting like crazy to keep our culture and our language alive. So I hope that helps. But this legislation would be impact for us, reconciliation. Because we're at odds with First Nations as well in some ways. But we got to build bridges with our brothers and sisters. We're not taking anybody's pie. There's enough for everybody. And our services lack within our nation.
Justement.
Yes, we asked this question earlier, but in your opinion, why do some First Nations and some communities, some Métis communities, oppose this legislation?
Well, it's because, again, they feel that, you know, we do come from, like I come from a descendant of a Cree Cookum that's in Iroquois. And there was a time that 300 years ago we were Iroquois, or I was Cree, but I was also a distinct Scottish and distinct French. And through that history, we came together and created a language and a culture that was distinct and different. Opitawasamik. That's what the Cree called us, those who govern themselves, the flower people. The First Nations were seeing it within ourselves, that how we created our own sense of being in government, our own sense of ways of life. So in First Nations, it's not about, like I said, is it because, and you look at 40 years ago, which is just when the Constitution was being in play, were they consulted? Was there proper consultation going on? We don't know at the time. I'm going to say I'm not an expert in that. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. But what I do know, I've got over 300 years of culture in me that says, I have a voice now. And if I speak up, I'm not going to go to jail. And if there's 3 or 4 of us in a gathering, we're not in a legal assembly. Those laws of the Indian Act apply to us in many ways. So today I sit here and hoping that we have a better future for our children, but we're not going anywhere. First Nations are not going anywhere. But we got to build a better Canada than what Canada is. And our Indigenous people can play a major role in building that. Because at a time in history, we got kicked out of Canada's ways, how to build. And we were dictated on what to do and where to live. Script came up earlier. My parents had script. But then you look at our stories. A simple bottle of whiskey took one family's script away because he had no idea what was going on. Land base was all about we share the land. European mentality was, I want a piece of land. But we didn't know the values. Well, we all do it. I'll just go elsewhere. There was lots of land to be had in Canada. That's why we went into the bush, and we lived there, and we lived off the land. Some days my mom and dad want to go there and live there back there. They want to be there. But we were in a housing project in Chetwynd, we were put into it in 1972. There was even a documentary done on my people, Mogsden Flats. It's on YouTube. So yes, this will build, in my eyes, a better nation. And plus, we'll have better times playing when we go play in Aboriginal hockey together.
Si vous pouvez.
If you could convince the First Nations that oppose this bill, what would you really tell them? And how would you help dispel their fears about this legislation?
You are us, we are you. We all belong to the same people. We all bleed red. Because I've had this debate with many. My best friend is First Nations. My best friend is his brother's a chief. And when I live in my northern area, where Mr. Zimmer's from, in the Northeast, where I grew up, where all my family still exists, we have great dialogue up there because we talk to each other. We haven't lost our ways with First Nations where I'm from. It's going back to that table and talking to one another. I'm going to say this in a statement here, and I'm not going to, because of embarrassment. I have a friend that his child has got a treaty card, and if you want to use blood quantum, it's 10% blood quantum. And I'm almost 100% blood quantum, but I'm Métis. My great-grandfather wanted us to be free people. We will not be put on, as he said, into a farm, into a cage. We exerted our rights back in the day, and I'm learning that. But now I'm learning to speak up and hear my voice. I am my ancestors' voice now. I speak for them who were silenced. And that's why I'm a passionate person. And I consider myself a warrior. But a warrior that needs to build peace. And blessed are the peacemakers. That's how I see myself. And I hope other First Nations see themselves as that, as well as other. And as we see in other parts of the world, there's great strife going on. I hope we never see a Canada like that. And I want to be building. I want my children and my children's children to be better, a part of a great Canada.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to have to jump in and move to Ms. Itloot for her 6 minutes.
I'd like to give Grand Chief Joe Abram a very quick response to the great testimony that Dean Gladio just shared with us. My intervention, I don't know if you've been hearing, have been hoping that there's solidarity between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And when I heard your testimony, I didn't hear a strong sense of solidarity that you want with Métis. And I wonder, having heard Dean speak, if you could share your reaction to that.
Yes, thank you for that question. Our major issue, and I don't really have an issue overall with Métis people, but our real issue is in Ontario, and specifically with the Métis Nation of Ontario, where they're having real claims to consultation rights and harvesting rights within our homelands. We know their objectives are about land, and this legislation is tied to that. I'm not a lawyer, but we did speak with several about this issue. And I understand that the Supreme Court of Canada has made it clear that the foundation of Section 35 rights in Canadian law is about our presence in our homelands before Europeans came here. In other words, it's our pre-existing relationship with land over which the Crown now asserts jurisdiction that is the very foundation of Section 35 rights in Canadian law. So we can't speak about Section 35 rights without speaking about land, because without that relationship with land, there would be no Section 35 rights. And so even in Supreme Court's 1996 decision in Vanderpeet, these were the words of Chief Justice Latimer. The doctrine of Aboriginal rights exists and is recognized and affirmed by Section 35 because of one simple fact: when Europeans arrived in North America, Aboriginal peoples were already here, living in communities on the land and participating in distinctive cultures as they had done for centuries. It is this fact, and the fact above all others, which separates Aboriginal peoples from all other minority groups in Canadian society, and which mandates the special legal and now constitutional status. So more specifically, what that Section 35 does is it provides the constitutional framework through which the fact that Aboriginals lived on a land in distinctive societies with their own practices, traditions, and cultures is acknowledged and reconciled with the sovereignty of the Crown. And so recognizing that Section 35 right to self-government is necessarily about land, because there cannot be Section 35 rights without that pre-existing relationship with specific homelands. So the Supreme Court in Powley did say that there were Métis Nation Ontario who had Section 35 rights, and we're not asking Parliament to ignore that. But no court in Canada, including its top court, has ever recognized Métis rights to self-government anywhere in Ontario, let alone across the entire province. So when it comes to Métis in general, we don't have an issue, but we know that, and specifically in Ontario, the Métis Nation of Ontario is vastly overreaching in terms of what kind of recognition they're going to be get, and that's our major concern. And if Canada had consulted with us, then they would have known that. And in fact, Canada has run fast in the other direction with discussion or answers. They've been acting as though we do not already have well-established treaty relationships with them. They've turned their back on a covenant chain and the process agreed to through it to resolve disputes by meeting in council and discussing issues of concerns between the treating nations. So not only has Canada not consulted, it's breaching fundamental treaty obligations by refusing to sit down with us to hear concerns and engage in reasoned dialogue. The only thing that we have is this process here today. And there's a recent decision from the Supreme Court in Quebec that talks about the covenant chain and the dispute resolution process. That case involved two individuals from the Mohawks of Kahnawake, but its
sorry,
discussion
Grand
of the
Chief,
covenant chain applies
Grand Chief
equally
Abram,
to our First Nations
my apologies.
in Ontario.
We're losing your sound quality, so I'm going to just stop here for a second. And sometimes with buffering or other things, the technical stuff I don't understand, it might get better, but just give it a pause here and we'll see if the interpretation either catches up or comes back. Okay, if you want to resume, and I apologize for cutting you off there, but yeah, please resume now. No, okay, I'm getting a no, it's not.
Okay, if you're going to legislate something.
No, just a second.
No?
Just a second.
How about now?
Not yet.
Okay. I'll slow down a little bit.
I was wanting to
It's,
interrupt
yeah,
him
it's
anyway,
the
John.
connection is destabilized, if that's a word, since we started, and so it's getting a bit choppy. So there's about a minute left.
Sir, I was wanting to interrupt him anyway
Okay.
because I wanted to ask Dean
Okay,
a
so
question.
we're going to end there, and yeah, Ms. Idlut does have a question for Mr. Gladue, so we're going to go over. So there's still about a minute and a bit, Ms. Idlut.
Koyanami, thank you. I wanted to ask you, Dean, thank you so much for sharing your story. And I wonder, one of the pieces of sections in this bill talks about the Métis, the three Métis nations seeking self-governance in Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan are authorized. With you being in British Columbia, could you describe how we could better understand how those became to be authorized to negotiate these as collectives, and what that looks like for you and why you support those three nations in that way?
Well, first of all, as I say, we're all cousins. We got cousins throughout. I got cousins that when we look at the different Métis settlements, the Métis traditional communities, a lot of our families started there, then they'd turn out again, then they'd bring out again. My family, my mother's family, ended up in Kelly Lake, community of Kelly Lake, northeastern British Columbia, which is a known Métis community as well. But it's still trying to get recognition to this day. So we've been involved with that. So BC is saying, we've been here. Where's our rights to be heard and voiced? Our services. The evidence-based land, I always say to people, that's a whole different debate. But services and programs to help our people, making sure we're getting cultural sound programs, that our children are learning their language, they're learning their culture. We're still struggling with that in BC. In fact, there's a bill coming through the education, Bill C-40 right now, that is going to take that all away from us again. It's cultural genocide in different ways. And that's why I'm a passionate person for my nation, because this is the voice my ancestors wanted. And some were shut down in different ways. Some were jailed, some were shot, and some ran. And some houses were literally burnt over history. So, but my house won't be burnt because I got fire insurance.
And with that, we are going to need to end this round. And unfortunately, colleagues, that's the amount of time that we have. We do have a brief in-camera discussion that I need to have, so I'm going to suspend. We'll need to clear the room. I need our members online to get back into the closed session as quickly as possible. It's a question where next week is our last planned week of hearings on C-53, and so there's just a question I have to put to the committee on that. And so we're going to suspend and resume in camera as quickly as possible. And thank you to both of our witnesses for joining us. Really appreciate you making time to be here with us today.
Thank you.